Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. We've got some more 3Racing X Reel this week. Specifically, we're going to be putting together the dampers. They're not the usual diaphragm type, but rather they're air bleed. They're similar to the ones that we fitted to the G-Made GOM a few weeks ago, just a little bit more simple. Right then, we're on page 17 and we need to open up bag 5. There's lots of nice looking bits in there and a bottle of oil. It has a label that says 350, which could just be 35 weight, but I can't really be sure. So rather than guess, I've pulled a bottle of 30 weight off the shelf. That way we have a known baseline if we decide to change the viscosity later. There's lots of plastic parts, and as usual some of them are broken free from the parts trees, so we need to be careful that we don't lose any. Some of them could easily roll away. The damper bodies look very well made. There's no scratches or burrs. Very nice. They're still a bit brown though, but that's the colour scheme 3Racing chose, so that's what we've got. The small parts bag contains the shafts and a few other metal bits, but importantly it contains lots of O-rings, so when cutting into the bag to open it we need to be very careful not to damage any. Since most of the bits we've got here are for this page, we'll just start sorting them straight onto the parts list. We've got 4 of the large skinny O-rings, 4 4-hole pistons. Other hole counts are available on the parts trees too. 4 M2x4 screws, 8 of the small clear O-rings, 8 E-clips, and 4 fibre washers that come in this little separate bag. From the parts trees there's the 4 bottom caps, 4 top caps, 4 preload nuts, 4 O-ring covers, as 3Racing put it, 4 smaller O-ring covers, 4 O-ring spacers, 4 damper shafts, 4 ball ends, and I'm sure you've picked up the pattern by now, 4 damper bodies. The first step of the build is to fit the piston to the shaft. They've gone with a simple method of just using a pair of E-clips, one above and one below. All we do is clip one in, slide on the piston, and clip the second E-clip to keep it all together. As usual with this type of build, we will put one together in the video and I'll do the other 3 off camera to save all the repetition. Next we've got the O-rings and the spacers that go into the bottom of the damper body. They want us to pop the shaft in and then slide the O-rings over the top into the body. But I'm not going to do it like that though. I'm going to fit the O-rings into the body, then slide the shaft in after. Using some very thick silicone oil for lubrication, it doesn't really matter which way round we do it, it's just personal preference. Between each layer we'll just squirt a nice blob of the silicone oil, making sure it gets nicely squeezed around as we go. The first part to go in is the small O-ring cover, followed by an O-ring, the thick spacer, another O-ring, the large O-ring cover, and lastly the bottom cap. If it's all gone well, there should be a bit of the thick silicone oil in the bottom of the damper body, and the hole in the end should be well and truly plugged up. Strictly speaking, you don't really want the thick oil in the body messing with the viscosity of the damper oil. If these were going to be used in racing, a touring car or something, you'd want to be a bit more careful. But this is a crawler, you're really not going to notice the difference once it's all put together. The main thing is that they're a lot less likely to start leaking. I first tried using the thick oil on the G-Made GOM, and I've since built a couple of other low-cost damper sets too, and so far there's no sign of any leakage. When the shafts gently press through the O-rings, all we need to do is wipe off the excess oil. While we're here, we might as well thread on the preload adjuster too. It should spin very freely up to the top. The one thing to watch out for though is that you actually get it the right way up. Next we've got the ball end. These are just your basic moulded plastic parts. Now usually we just grab the shaft with a pair of pliers and screw it on, but 3Racing have specifically said to tap the threads first. This does make a lot of sense. It's going to make it a lot easier to thread onto the shaft and reduce the risk of slipping and causing damage. A set of taps is always very handy to have. There's not much to them, they're just a hardened steel screw thread that cuts material rather than just pushes it out the way. For metal parts, a taper tap is good to have as it cuts the threads nice and gradually. A bit of lubricant isn't a bad idea too. On the plastic parts we use in RC, starting with a plug tap does the job just fine. It has a much shorter taper, so you can thread holes almost right to the bottom. For most RC bits, an M3 and an M4 is a good start, with M2 and 2.5 sometimes coming in handy too, but they can be a bit delicate. All we do is screw the tap into the ball end, being very careful to get it started straight. Then, every few turns, wind it back and forth a little bit just to clear the threads. Sometimes, if the threads are deep enough, it's not a bad idea to remove the tap entirely and blow out the swarf. Now we can screw the ball end onto the shaft with very little force, which means we don't have to grip the shaft all that tightly with the pliers, which all but removes any risk of gouging the surface. Next, we've got the top of the dampers to sort out. I should probably mention I somehow lost the ability to read and tried to build them purely from the diagrams, which didn't quite go to plan. Partially my fault, of course, but perhaps the diagrams aren't quite as clear as they could be. Where I got it wrong is I saw the skinny O-ring as being fitted inside the cap. There's even a nice little lip for it to go around. I added some thick oil and popped it in place, but more about this in a minute. The next step is pretty typical. We need to fill the damper with oil, in this case 30-way axial stuff. We need to fill it pretty much to the top, then push the shaft up and down fairly gently a few times to get the air past the piston before topping up the oil. Usually this is good enough, but if you really want to make sure, you can leave the damper with the cap off for an hour or so to make sure all the air has risen to the surface before topping it up. The cap goes on now, and this is where I noticed there was English text under the diagrams which tells you to install the O-ring on the bottom of the threads. Luckily I hadn't done the cap up tight, so it unscrewed with very little fuss. I then slid the O-ring over the threads. A little bit of a pain, but no damage done, so I think we'll get away with it. Now the cap can properly be fitted, and we can bleed the damper by pressing the shaft all the way up to the top. It'll squirt out a fair bit of oil, so make sure you're doing it over something to catch it. Ideally you want the damper to be upright. Now I had a bit of an angle, but that's due to me not really being able to see what I'm doing past the camera. To seal it up we use one of the M2 screws and a small fibre washer. Screw the screw in all the way, then just a little bit more to make sure it's nicely sealed against the washer/gasket. Now all we do is make up 3 more, so we've got a set of 4 dampers ready for the next page. Right then, page 18. We're going to need more or less all the rest of the bits from bag 5. 5 metal balls, 8 M3x15s, 4 of the thin metal spacers, 4 springs, and 4 spring retainers, or spring base covers if you like. Step 1 is to fit the springs, which is as straightforward as ever. We slide the spring over the damper body, compress it a bit, and clip the retainer over the shaft and slide it over the ball end. Couldn't be easier. Next we clip a ball into the cap. Now we need 2 left ones and 2 right ones. It doesn't really matter, but 3Racing have the screws that seal the caps pointing towards the centre of the chassis. And since the balls only have a flange on one side, we need to keep in mind which side we install them from. At the bottom we need another ball, and this time it really doesn't matter which way round, as we can just turn the shaft to make it work. Do all 4 and we can start mounting them to the chassis. The top of the front dampers mount to the hole towards the rear of the mount using one of the small spacers. Do them up until they're just snug, and if you try and move the damper in and out, you'll be able to see if the ball is moving on the screw thread. It only needs to be tight enough just to take out the slop. The bottom is a bit more of a faff. Due to the positioning and the fact the axle moves around, it can be a bit tricky to get it all lined up and do up the screw. I found holding the chassis between my legs, using my left hand to steady the axle and my right to start the screw did the trick. Still a bit of a fiddle though. Install both, and that's the front suspension hung. I have to say, it does feel very nice and smooth with no tight spots. I'm suitably impressed. The rear dampers are all but the same, the only difference is the lack of the spacer, and of course the top mounts go in the frontmost holes. Not surprisingly, the rear feels just as smooth as the front. Well, that's it for bag 5, so this is where we're going to end the video. Next time it's going to be on with bag 6 on page 19 and the servos. Should be fun. So, as always, thanks for watching. A like is always appreciated, and if you're not already, by all means subscribe and leave a comment if you got something to say. Bye guys!